Hello and welcome to the Berean Bookclub podcast with your hosts Francois Poe and Conrad Rieder, the podcast where we discuss books written by saints both dead and alive to see what they can teach us and the church today and hopefully spur us on in our love for Christ. We're so glad you're joining us. Hello friends, welcome to this episode of the Berean Bookclub. I'm so glad you are joining us here as we are going to be talking about Rembrandt in the Wind by Russ Ramsey. A very cool book about art and actually about artists as well and their stories. So we're really excited to talk about this. How are you doing, Conrad, on this fine evening?
Good. I'm very excited to smash this episode. This book has been the funnest book we've read, I think, for me at least. Just the way in which he tells the stories of these artists, it's been like so incredible. It's been awesome. So I'm stoked. I'm stoked to chat through it a bit.
The audiobooks that are the best to listen to are always the ones where the author reads it themselves. And that's the case with many audiobooks. But here, Russ has got such an amazing voice. So such like a deep...
Yeah, it's like George Ezra.
Yeah. That kind of voice. But he works so hard at pronouncing the names correctly of these artists. We're not even going to try. But he's like, he was like, I'm sure like he took like a few days out of his life and was like, okay, I'm going to practice. I need to be able to say this. Michelangelo. It's just like every time.
It's excellent. So as he's kind of like working through these artists and stuff, he's obviously mentioning some of their works and things. I was just saying this to someone last week. And you can't help but like want to go and see what the paintings are like. So you're like listening with Google open the whole time and you're like Googling these paintings and stuff. But sometimes you can't actually figure out how to spell the name that he's just pronounced with like this Italian like pizzazz or whatever. So it's very funny, but he's really worked hard at kind of like, just being authentic.
Yeah.
And he's a fantastic storyteller and he's really got a good way of drawing you in.
He really wanted to honor the artists as well. Their lives and their stories. And that's one way in which he does that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's dive into the book. I think a good place to maybe start, Conrad, is maybe answer for us, why did Russ write this book, or what do you think he's trying to achieve with this book?
The subtitle of the book is Learning to Love Art Through the Eyes of Faith, I think. And so at a very basic level, that's definitely what he's trying to do. He's trying to like foster a love within his readers for art, but for the Christian in particular, to engage with art in and through our walk with Jesus. His concern, and he kind of like unpacks this in chapter 1 a bit, his concern is that sometimes we maybe tend to move away from like beautiful things and rather only pursue good things or true things. So he says that sometimes Christians in the West, he's speaking about, Christians in the West have tended to kind of like focus a lot on moral assent or intellectual assent, and that to the expense of pursuing beautiful things. This all comes off the back of a conversation where he's kind of like leaning on Aquinas and other philosophers, speaking about what they call the transcendentals, which are the three basic kind of human desires which distinguish humans from the rest of creation. We have a desire for goodness, we have a desire for truth, and we have a desire for beauty. And in his opening chapter, he kind of like tries to show this to be the case in Genesis. But he only does that to make the case that he feels like sometimes we neglect the pursuit of beauty for the pursuit of goodness and truth, moral assent and intellectual assent. And so he's in some ways perhaps trying to correct that. to teach a love and an appreciation and an active pursuit for beauty as well, just so that we can hold those three things in tensions as human beings, because he feels like we are created for that, and he's at pains throughout the book to show how not only the artists who create these masterpieces are kind of like drawn to creating some kind of like a transcendent beauty, but without you even knowing as a reader, you see how that's true of you as you're like drawn into like the story that he's telling, and as he's describing these sculptures and these paintings, you can't help but want to go see it. You want to be like captured, like he is captured. And so I think at a deeper level, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to foster a love for art and for beauty. But he's trying to do that particularly because he feels like sometimes we move away from that as Christians, and that shouldn't be the case for him. That shouldn't be the case.
I think it was very helpful for us, especially maybe as Protestants, to just recapture that like sense of beauty, as we've at times been tempted to move away against like the Catholic idea of art and the way Christ was portrayed in art and all those kind of things. And it is a corrective in a certain sense to call us back to pursuing beauty and the ability of beauty to kind of show something to us. It was really, really good. It did constantly like draw your imagination out to see that there are ways in which beauty speaks to us, whether that is looking at these artworks, and I think especially standing in front of them, something that I don't know, I haven't had the chance to do, like actually go and witness one of these artworks.
But don't you want to now after you've read this book?
But even just say if we go to Morgan's Bay and we just watch those waves crash over and the sun coming over, and it's beautiful. And we all know that beauty has this ability to do something in us that we can't put into words. And he's asking us as Christians to pursue that a bit more. And I thought that was good.
Yeah. I have a quote here, maybe just to sum up kind of like his intention and his explanation behind some of the stuff. He in his mind, with those three, beauty, goodness, and truth, beauty for him is almost an application of goodness and truth. So they're not like disconnected, but he feels like if goodness and truth are applied, we are captured by a beauty. That is beauty for him. So he says, beauty takes the pursuit of goodness past mere personal ethical conduct to the work of intentionally doing good to and for others. Beauty takes the pursuit of truth past the accumulation of knowledge to the proclamation and application of truth in the name of caring for others. Beauty draws us into deeper community. We ache to share the experience of beauty with other people, to look at someone near us and say, do you hear that? Do you see that? How beautiful. So for him, these kind of desires of goodness and truth, he's not trying to put those against beauty. He's trying to say when we see those in action worked out towards one another in community, that is what beauty is. When we stand together and we look at what is good and we look at what is true and we say like, wow, did you see that? Do you see that? And so it's off the back of that he writes what he does. Through the book, just the shape of the book, the way that it kind of like forms, is he looks at 9 different artists' sculptors. Not many sculptors, actually, 1, 2.
Yeah, I think only 2.
And a bunch of artists, both Christians and both non-Christians. But he's very clear from up front that for him, he feels like beauty exists in brokenness. And that might sound like an odd thing to say, because maybe in our minds we connect perfection and beauty almost like synonyms. But he actually is, as I pains throughout every single chapter, to show that there's actually beauty in brokenness, in limitation, in fallenness. And for him, obviously, that's deeply cast in Genesis with the fall and so on. And us being image bearers who are kind of marred or tainted or cracked. But there's a beauty as we seek for something which nothing in this world can offer us. And so he looks at 9 artists. The one thing which is in common between all of those artists is brokenness. In many different ways, as they struggle with sin, as they struggle with mental illness, as they struggle with like social things, and
lots of stuff,
lots of mess and stuff. But he's able to show
it's
how
messy.
like the beauty lies there for him in particular, in brokenness. And that's what lies at the heart of each of these artists.
Especially the ability in that brokenness to produce something so beautiful that years and years and years after their death, it's still being looked at by lots of people. It's fascinating. So maybe just a question for you on the back of him kind of speaking about the way in which brokenness or beauty that comes from brokenness. There may be a temptation for us to think that the more broken something is, the more beautiful, kind of the more beauty it can create. And it does seem to me that the New Testament does hold up a certain sense, even if we talk about our leaders, certain way in which their moral character does matter. And of course, we're all broken, but the brokenness he talks about in the artists' lives are pretty rough, all the way from like murderers to serious issues.
Yes.
So my mind was thinking, like, just like some of those guys said to Paul, like, should we sin more so that grace may abound? In the same way, should we look for more broken people, because that's where God's gonna work, and bring about beauty. I wonder if you maybe have anything. What do you think he'd respond to something like that?
So, I mean, maybe just 2 thoughts. The first is most of the artists he's talking about, they are broken, like in the best sense of that word. Emotionally, some of them even mentally. Vincent, when he cuts off his ear, he tells that story like super vividly.
Yes.
Other of these artists, like regularly seeing prostitutes, not faithful to their wives, and so on. Some of them doing those things, being followers of Jesus. Some of them not followers of Jesus. But not all of the artists he speaks about is broken in that sense. Some by brokenness, he doesn't just mean like morally you are wrecked. He's speaking about like creation in general, just being lacking and longing. So I don't recall what the guy's surname is, but it's I think the third last artist he speaks about, I think his first name is Henry, the African American artist who moves to France. The brokenness in his story that produces his art is kind of like a social brokenness. As he like struggles through like social inequality and racism and that kind of stuff, and how his art is kind of birthed out of that. And so I think at least in part for Ramsey, the brokenness, the brokenness in which we see beauty is more than just like an individual and a moral brokenness. There's a kind of like a broad
universal
effect. Yes, that's the
universal
right word. A universal brokenness.
To which beauty stands out.
Correct. And I think, to say maybe secondly, for him, the beauty isn't in the brokenness, but the beauty lies in what the brokenness longs for or points towards. So right in the beginning, he's kind of like got a question, like, why do we engage with beauty? And he gives three reasons. The second reason he gives is, he says, beauty shows us where we are wrong. And I think the point that he's trying to get across is like, we see when we see the beautiness or the beauty of something, or the gloriousness of something, we're able to see where we are lacking. And so what's beautiful about brokenness isn't that it's broken, but what's beautiful about it is the glory which it points towards not being there. Those two things being said, the caution is obviously necessary. We don't want to overcompensate and end up just pursuing a brokenness for the sake of brokenness, as you've kind of alluded to, Paul, just pursuing sin for the sake of sin because it's nice when Jesus forgives us. That's, I think, like misusing and misunderstanding grace for Paul, and that's misusing maybe like the beauty that's on display here, you know. I'm not sure if that speaks for him so much. That's at least how I've understood what he's trying to do here.
That's even helpful for me as I've been grappling with that. Maybe then, as we kind of get into some of the artists, maybe you just want to pick up on one or two of the artists that really struck you, and we can maybe talk about them.
Yeah. Maybe before we get kind of going on the artists, there's one thing that this book has so clearly changed my mind on. A number of years ago, I was actually chatting to you about this, I think last week or the week before. I did a short course on graphic design. And in the intro lesson, the lecturer kind of like tried to verse art and design off against one another. And the case that he was trying to make is that a design is objective. You use particular fonts and shapes and lines and colors to convey a very particular message as a designer. Where art is subjective, he said. Art is kind of like a free-for-all. You approach it and it makes you feel a certain way, and it's going to make your mate feel a different way, and there's no real kind of like intentionality behind it. My mind has done like a full flip on that. As he tracks the stories of these artists, he's at pains to show that their art is intentional. It's birthed out of a very particular context, and very particular kind of stories and circumstances for all of them. Some of those circumstances may be a little bit more kind of like subconscious than conscious for them, but they each certainly have a intention in putting forth this piece of work. And so just at like a big picture level, that's something which really struck me. As he's gone about explaining the art of all these artists, the beauty lies primarily almost in the story, and the person which births these like artworks, which has just been like incredible. The second thing, before we get going on some of the art pieces that stood out to me and stories, is he is a fantastic storyteller, and I cannot possibly do him justice. So I'm going to try my best to very briefly explain some of the context, at least around a few things which stood out to me. But you must go and give this book a read.
This is like easy to listen to. It's really, really good. Good listening, and he is a great storyteller. But you can lower your voice a bit, and then you can go for it.
So the first is he's got a whole chapter on Michelangelo's David.
You got to try.
Or as he would say, Michelangelo de Mostri de Mostri. That's his full name. But Michelangelo's sculpture of David. The story goes very briefly that Michelangelo wasn't the original guy commissioned to make the sculpture. The city had a plan to have a few of these biblical characters to kind of like line the welcome area of something. So much for my storytelling. So this huge piece of marble was brought from somewhere. The biggest piece of marble to be used as like a single stone to sculpt something. And two artists two sculptors had given it a bash over the span of 15, 20 years, maybe 10, 15 years. And they both had kind of like been fired or lost interest. The first guy who actually arranged, who was initially employed to do the thing, he like drilled a massive hole in the middle of the piece of marble just to make it easier to get from these quarries to the place where he was going to be working on it. And it took 2 years. That's how big the stone was.
It was huge, eh?
It took 2 years back then just to move from there to the city where it would start being worked on. Anyways, once the marble arrived, everyone was like, why did this oak ruin it like this? It was like a really narrow piece of marble already, and he made it even more narrow, and he drilled a big hole where he thought the legs would go. So, I mean, he wasn't like messing around. He had really thought like, I'm going to chip this piece of marble away anyways. I'm going to drill through here. I'm going to chip away here. I'm going to cut just to make it lighter. Anyways, and he was fired because everyone thought, hey, he had ruined the piece of marble. And when they had come and look at it, it wasn't as fine of a selection as what they had anticipated. Next guy, about 10 years later, picks up the chisel and stuff, but he also doesn't get very far. And it's a number of years later where Michelangelo actually kind of puts himself forward. He's 26 years old at the time, and says, "Hey, let me do it." And it takes him 2 years. He builds like a little wax kind of prototype, and he works off of that. And he creates this like incredible art piece. What's unique about it in its time is that all other depictions of David have been kind of after his battle scene with Goliath. But this is the first one, the first work, which is of David before he defeats Goliath. It's actually of David as he kind of stands with a sling on over his shoulder, looking towards Goliath almost. I've Googled pictures of it. It's quite stunning. And just because our phones are always listening to us, there's like other stuff been popping up like on Instagram and so on about this statue. And I saw this one thing on Instagram that there's like a certain, like a tendon or a ligament, which you can see on the statue, which is only like visible in a human arm when you lift your pinky. And that's like the level of precision detail that is put into this work. Anyways, it's an incredible story. This thing is carted to be put up where they wanted to put up. They realized they're going to have to like take half of the place down in order to get the thing in there, and it's there for a while, and then it got moved to the place where it is still standing today. Actually, this is a piece that you can still go and see. Two things, just application points, kind of, that he draws from this, and they're really sobering. The first thing that he kind of like mentions about Michelangelo is just like his pursuit of perfection and this like glorious kind of like masterpiece that he was working towards. He had like a real love for like the human body and physique. We're fairly certain historically that Michelangelo had some struggles with some particular sexual desires and so on. And this kind of like is displayed in his art, and just the accuracy with which he is able to depict and portray the human body, particularly the male body. And so it's a magnificent piece of work. But this is a piece of work which it's a piece of stone which he inherited. It's not something that he could start from scratch. In actual fact, it was actually ruined by two sculptors who had come before him, who had maybe chosen a piece of stone which wasn't of the highest quality, had cut parts away of it, which should have perhaps stayed there. And it lay for years and years and years in the wind and rain and hail and whatever. So this is a piece of stone which he didn't have a choice. He picked
it was the hand that was dealt to him.
Precisely, the hand that was dealt to him, and he took that and he made a masterpiece out of it. And Russ Ramsey's got this kind of like just this little excursus that he goes on how as humans we are so similar. We're so almost at the mercy of others who have laid the foundations before us. We have been molded and shaped and chipped away by many things, by many people and influences around us. And then he gets to a point where he says, we need to come to terms with the fact that each of us are laying a foundation and molding and shaping and chipping away at others. And that, for better or for worse, he says. He's not like romantic about it by any means. For better or for worse, we mold and we shape one another. Yes, it's a hand that we are dealt, but we've got an influence on one another, on those around us. As he says, after he says that, Lord, have mercy on us. It's a really sobering thought. In some ways, this is a kind of like an introduction on his part to a theme which he touches on a little bit more in depth when he gets to Vermeer and the chapter after Vermeer. I can't remember who that was now. One of the main points that he's trying to make in the book is that we create beauty in community. It's never something which we do in isolation. Even if an artist works in isolation, a little bit later on when he's speaking about Vermeer, Vermeer is kind of like what makes his art unique is this optical device that he was able to use, which allowed him to paint with incredible like precision, which just made his art like radically stand out from those around him. But there's other clues in his art, like certain lines and stuff, like lines of light and stuff, which you can tell is used in optical device, because that's not something which is visible to the naked eye. And he concludes that chapter by saying, we need one another to create. And he kind of like arcs back to Genesis here, how Adam's given a task, but he is only able to fulfill that task when he's given a helper, when there's community to do that with him, as he's got the mandate, as Ramsey would say, to beautify Eden. And speaking about Vermeer a little bit later on, he goes like, yes, he's the only one painting, but someone stretched that canvas over that frame. Someone made that easel. Someone made that paint. Someone made that optical device for him. Someone stood there so that he could paint them. We never create in isolation. And this is a foretaste to that theme, which Ramsey's trying to unpack here. Because for Michelangelo, yes, it's said that sometimes he would be in his shed for 2 days, for days on end, and no one would see him. But that young man inherited that piece of work, that piece of marble from other men who molded and shaped it. And whether he likes or not, he's not alone. He's not, for better or for worse, he's not alone in the creation of that piece of art. We need one another, is the point Ramsey will make later on in the book, to create beauty. Beauty exists only in community.
And I think like one of the things that he mentions as he talks about that, even the blind pianist, that piano was created by someone who could see. There's no one that creates without the influence of other people, and that's something that only belongs to God. You know, he's the one that creates ex nihilo, as they would say, out of nothing. God is the one that creates. And now as we as humans go out, we are only sub-creators. But because we're made in the image of God, that's part of, just a part of who we are. Me and you started Eden Creative, and our slogan is very cheesy, created to create.
But he said it. He said it in chapter 1. Did you hear?
Yeah. And so, I mean, everyone says it every now and then. but that was birthed out of this kind of desire. We don't know much about art. But the art of just creating, just thinking of an idea and trying to express that through visual or photography, or even as you prepare a sermon and you think about how to communicate. There's something very, very exhilarating to be able to do that and to express ourselves like that.
Yes.
That he's just again shown me how beautiful it is.
Yeah, oh man. The second thing, and maybe the final thing, which is just really stark about his conclusion of the chapter on Michelangelo's David, is just the strong possibility that that statue will someday fall, and implode or explode. Michelangelo, I mean, this truly is a masterpiece. By the sounds of it, I mean, Ramsey knows his stuff, but by the sounds of it, if you've seen Michelangelo's David, you don't need to see another sculpture. Like, if you want to see a good sculpture, you can see that one, and you don't need to see another one. Like, that's the and this was created hundreds of years ago. It's an incredible piece of work. It's massive, apparently. But this masterpiece, this most glorious creation of Michelangelo, is finite. As good and as almost perfect as it is in the world of sculptures, its heels are cracked, apparently, and the sheer weight, because it's a single block. I mean, all that weight lies there. The way in which the torso compared to the hips is pivoted because of that massive hole that the first sculptor had drilled into it, makes for a particular kind of like force that's exerting itself on his legs. And so some people, some critics are fairly certain that it will someday implode. He says that the museum where it's at, I think it's a museum, says like, no, it's fine, it's not going to fall. But what they do say, and what they'll at least admit, is that the greatest danger to the sculpture is an earthquake. If an earthquake had to come, this masterpiece, this perfect male body, in all its glory and all its beauty, will crumble. And there's a picture there for Ramsey, just of the finiteness of this world, even though that beauty that's in that statue points towards something transcendent and something eternal. The fact that that statue will probably crumble one day is just testimony to the fact that that cannot be the ultimate sense of beauty and perfection. It's imperfect. It's busy wasting away.
Yeah, no, it is. It is.
So that's those are two things which really strike me about the David one. I wonder if he intentionally put that up front, because man, it just grips you like, if this is chapter one.
I wanted to say it is definitely at least the story that really gripped me the most. Caravaggio, I don't even know how to say it. That was also quite a story. Actually, they all have fascinating stories. It's really difficult to kind of like narrow it down, but it's worth a listen, even just for I think listen to chapter 3 where he talks about beauty, and then this first one definitely. So we just finished talking about that sculpture of David by Michelangelo, and that's just like one example of 9 other artists that he talks about in a similar fashion. But we checked the time and we're already going over 30 minutes, and so it's going to be quite difficult to talk about Rembrandt and some of the others.
Mm.
So let's wrap it up there, and we just like to encourage you to really go and listen to the book. You won't be disappointed.
Yeah.
But maybe is there anything else that just stood out for you before we end the episode?
I think one thing that I just like to mention that struck me very early on, even in his introduction, is he kind of tells a brief story about Vincent van Gogh. He has a fight with his friend as is kind of like rising to the peak of his career, cuts off his earlobe, takes that to a local prostitute for some reason, I'm not sure. Anyways, the authorities hear about it. The next morning, they find him in his house. He's lying in his bed, like covered in blood, because he's obviously like cut his ear off, and he goes to spend some time in a insane asylum for a year. While he's there, he paints like a bunch of stuff. And out of everything that he paints during that year, he only paints 2 self-portraits. What's important to know at this point is that this episode of him cutting off his ear happened kind of like at the rise of him going to fame. And this like massively damaged his kind of like public image and his career in many ways as well, because yeah, I mean, as his work is starting to like get traction, something like this happens, and what's more is he's got this weird episode where he chops his ear, and then he ends up for a year in an insane asylum, and there's like a massive amount of shame and humiliation that goes with that, and so I think the number is 140 that he paints, 140 paintings during that year. And of those, only 2 are portraits. And of those 2 portraits, one portrait is of him, a self-portrait, is of him looking at the viewer, but with his head tilted and his bandaged ear showing to the viewer, not hidden away on the other side, but actually showing. And Ramsey goes on to explain how vulnerable of a self-portrait that is for him to have painted at that time, because of the shame and the humiliation, which are kind of like symbolized in this kind of bandaged ear.
Yeah.
For Ramsey, he's got a print of that in his office, in his study. And he says that he's hung it there to remind himself that when he is not willing to be vulnerable about his own brokenness, you shut out the ability to encounter beauty, because beauty is best displayed for him in our vulnerability and our brokenness, and in how Christ kind of comes to us in that and saves us from that. Yeah. And that was just a really I mean, he briefly tells a story as an introduction and explains the place that this painting has for him personally in his life. But in many ways, that just sums up the book so well.
I couldn't have said it better.
That there's this brokenness which exists in our world, which we portray in our art and stuff. But there's beauty in that vulnerability, and that willingness to be open with one another in the communities that we are in. Not because we're celebrating how bad we all are, but because the knowledge of our brokenness and our vulnerability with one another lifts all of our eyes to Christ, and to look forward to the day when those things are gone, when they're no more, to the real glory and the real beauty, which all creative work the side of eternity points to anyways. That was just an incredible story, and an illustration in many ways of what is not only trying to do in the book, but how we look at art differently as followers of Jesus.
That's actually what I wanted to mention as well, precisely that story. And I think as Christians, we communicate something of the beauty of Christ as we are confident to approach him in our brokenness. So by not concealing our brokenness and still coming in front of him, not because of our kind of works or anything. No, I'm coming with my ear cut off, but you still, while I was a sinner, Christ chose us. While we were sinners, he died for us. We communicate something of the greatness of God's love for his people, the way in which he has saved us, as we do not conceal our brokenness, but do not celebrate our brokenness as if that's something to be proud of, but rather celebrate Christ's love for us in our brokenness. And that was for me also, it really made me think of Augustine with his self-reflection, but that self-reflection never ending in kind of like this depressed kind of like Augustine, but rather, where does this all go? Like, oh, I'm questioning my motives. Oh, it all leads to God and appreciating him more. I think the other thing for us is just, it taught us to appreciate art. And so this feels like the start of a journey.
Hey?
You know, it feels like when we go to college and they teach you how to exegete the Bible, you're like, okay, here we go. Now, every book you come to, you're learning, how do I better interpret it? How do I understand the context? What are the ways in which the author is trying to communicate with the reader? And in the same way now, I feel like we're going to start to do that with art. Why is that there? What is the author what is the painter trying to communicate by making a big vase on the right hand side of the painting, or whatever the case may be?
Yeah.
And I'm like a fool that's excited about this new thing that he's found, and I do hope that it continues. So yeah, that's where I'm at and what I enjoyed.
No, bro, it's been a sweet read. Thanks for chucking it on the list.
No, thank you. You were the one that was really
I was very stoked.
shouting for it. Just quickly on to next month's book. No Shortcut to Success. This is not a self-help book. This is actually a book about how the church thinks about missions, and especially training missionaries, how we think about the doctrine of the church, how it relates to missions. And so I'm quite excited for the next one, as it really just delves in, how do we think about those who are serving as missionaries and how best to support them, and how best to think about us, our local churches, and how we think about missions and thinking about sending missionaries. So No Shortcut to Success by Matt Rhodes, I think is his name. So that's the one for next month. Thank you so much, guys, for sticking it out with us. If you're still with us, we really appreciate it. We'd love to hear from you, so please do comment on some of our Instagram posts or send us an email or message. You know where to find us. Thanks for listening. Grace and peace. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Berean Bookclub podcast. We'd love for you to head over to your podcasting app and give us a review and subscribe to the podcast. It will help us so much. This podcast was brought to you by BTI Stellenbosch. BTI Stellenbosch exists to bring theology to the church. If you want to find out more information, you can head over to btistellenbosch.com. Until next time.